Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned for my weekly reading report. It's time for my weekly reading report, that thrill-packed program where I talk about all the stuff that I read last week. And I did read some stuff. Despite last week being horrifically busy, I did manage to read some things. So let's talk about those things. I will break out my list for the 500 book challenge, the never ending challenge. It seems never ending. The never ending challenge where I have to read 500 books that I own before I'll buy any new ones. And as I mentioned earlier this week, earlier last week, I did reach book 300, which was this one, The Red Hawk by Edgar Rice Burroughs. So this was book 300. Excellent. It's part 3 of the Moon Maid trilogy by Edgar Rice Burroughs. I am slowly going through all of Edgar Rice Burroughs' books, and this was the next one on my list, and it was really, really good. At this point in the Moon Maid trilogy, it's been hundreds of years since the last part of the Moon Maid, hundreds of years since part 2. The Moon Men who have come down from the moon and conquered the Earth are pretty much wiped out. There's a band of them on the East Coast, there's a band of them on the West Coast. Humanity has been reduced to various warring tribes. They're fighting with each other as much as they fight against the Moon Men. And the tribes all across America are modeled very much on Native American tribes. But the Native Americans still exist, and they have been mostly reduced to slavery. They're the slaves of the Moon Men, and also some of them are slaves to the American tribes, because unfortunately, the tribes of Americans have really, really gone back to being barbarians, and their level of culture has degenerated to a state where they do keep slaves. And the Red Hawk is the leader of a group, a fairly large group of these Americans, and he's going to lead them into the territory of one of the last bands of the Moon Men, and he's going to battle the Moon Men and wipe them out in California. It's an interesting book. All American culture has pretty much been forgotten. This is so far into the future. And like I said, the level of culture has been reduced so much that they really don't remember the former culture of the United States. They don't know the world is round. Most of them. There's one smart character in this book who realizes the world is round, but nobody believes him. They all think he's crazy. And, they're illiterate. It's just, that's the level they've descended to. And our hero, the Red Hawk, is pretty savage, actually. Very brutal guy. He just loves to fight and go into battle. And he is the last of the Julians. I think he's Julian 20. I can't remember. I think he's Julian 20. And he is the leader of the band, because Julians always seem to be leaders. And Julian, as we remember, Julian was the guy who went to the moon in the first book of the Moon Maid. It's interesting because it's basically, aside from all of the fighting and daring do and all of that, it's basically a story about character. The Moon Men, like I said, have been reduced to a small band. They've interbred with humans. So they're slowly being, they're slowly disappearing anyway. And there's been a long-running feud between the Julians and a family that is now known as Ortis. And they hate each other because the ancestor of the Ortis family was the guy who was the enemy who he was basically the villain in the first part of the Moon Maid, and he led the Moon Men down to Earth, and he was a sneaky, awful villain. And so there's been a family feud. But in this book, at one point, Julian the Red Hawk is captured, and he actually meets an Ortis, a descendant of his, of the arch enemy of the Julians, and he's a decent guy. And this guy says to him, "Hey, I don't like the Moon Men any more than you do. Why should we hate each other because of something our ancestors fought about? I had nothing to do with that. You had nothing to do with that. Why should we still hate each other? Why don't we team up? Wouldn't that make more sense?" And this blows Red Hawk's mind. He's not the most sophisticated fellow in the world. And he's just so used to his beliefs, and he's so used to this feud that he realizes it makes sense what this guy's saying, but he just can't do it. But later on, he falls in love with a young woman, and wouldn't you know it, she's also an Ortis. So she's a member of the family that he should hate. And so he should hate her, but he can't. He loves her. And so he has to readjust and change his attitudes. And he has to change his attitudes about other things. Maybe it's not so great to just be some murderous savage. Maybe that's not the way forward for humanity. So it's interesting because of that. And it's a short little thing. And Edgar Rice Burroughs managed to get a lot of story into this short little book. Part 3 of the Moon Maid trilogy is excellent. So yeah, that was the Red Hawk. Then I moved on. This is going to take a while, Roger. I read a bit. Then I moved on to Armageddon 2419 AD, and with its kick-ass cover there. This is a story from, I think it was actually 2 stories. So it was Armageddon 2419 AD and its sequel are both put into this one book. So it's kind of a fix-up novel in that way. Although you can't really tell, at least I couldn't. It all runs very smoothly. And this is the story of a character who became Buck Rogers. So as it says on the cover, this is the original Buck Rogers book. The original Buck Rogers novel. But that's in quotes because the character in this is Anthony Rogers. And when it became time to make a comic strip out of this story, which they decided to do, Buck just sounded better than Tony. So they changed the character to Buck Rogers. But in this book, he's Anthony Rogers or Tony Rogers, which just doesn't sound the same. So they changed this character to Buck. And he is a 20th century man who had gone into suspended animation and wakes up into 2419 AD in the middle of a horrific war. So unlike you might expect from a Buck Rogers story, there are no spaceships in this. All of this takes place on Earth. And it's basically a war novel, a future war novel. Anthony Rogers wakes up in a world full of war. And the way he goes into suspended animation, he's in a cave that collapses and a gas is released. And this mysterious gas somehow makes him go into suspended animation where he just stays exactly as he is for hundreds of years and wakes up in the 25th century and just wanders out of the cave and runs into Wilma. Wilma is the first person he meets, Wilma Deering, who we all remember from the Buck Rogers television show. And she introduces him to, all that's going on in the 25th century, which is a disaster. So this book is very much a product of its time, the late 1920s. And the First World War overshadows everything in this book. This book is basically, I think, it's a book that is written in response to a horrific experience in a terrible war. And this imagines a world war of the 25th century. And what had happened is the Han Empire, Mongolians, have overrun the entire world and conquered the entire world. And this is sort of a Yellow Peril novel. There were a lot of Yellow Peril stories where, people in the 1920s were worried that Asians would just overwhelm the world and take over everything. That was a fear. And, based on xenophobia and racism. And that's what happens in this book. The Mongolians rise up and take over the world. But this happened a long time ago, hundreds of years ago. And so at this point, the Americans, it's very similar to the Red Hawk in this way. The Americans were reduced to being barbarians pretty much, and they had to hide from the Han Empire. But slowly over the years, they've regained their technological knowledge and have become a very scrappy, tough culture. And they are going to fight against the Han Empire. And the Han Empire, they've got a few cities in the United States. And they're protected by disintegrator rays. They have these rays that can disintegrate things. That they, it's a disintegrator ray. And they have flying ships, and they have just this high level of technology. But also the Hans have become very lazy because they have this super high level of technology. They have machines to do everything for them. So they just kind of laze around and they're just lazy. But they're super, super smart. And so the Americans have to come up with their own technology to battle the Hans. And it becomes a bloody and horrific war. One of the surprising things about this book is just how violent it is. It shouldn't be. I guess I was going in and I said, hey, it's a book about Buck Rogers. And it's a book about a horrific war of the future. And it's interesting in so many ways. Philip Francis Nolan was very interested, it seems, in technology. And he comes up with all of these war machines and vehicles and gadgets. And the course of the war is decided by the technology that these warring armies use. And he has interesting ideas about the cultures of these two warring groups. The Hans, like I said, are very lazy. And the women in the Han Empire, they're basically considered useless. They're less than slaves. They have no rights of their own. They need men to do anything or to even survive. Whereas in the Americans, the women are soldiers, just like everybody else. Wilma, when Buck Rogers meets her, is a soldier, and a tough one. And so that is interesting because that's unusual for, stories of this time. It could have been a result of the times changing. The women in America got the vote only a few years before. And so Philip Francis Nolan was thinking ahead to a time when women and men would actually be equal in American culture, at least. And so the women fight alongside the men. And Wilma Deering can be completely savage. One thing I was not expecting was, scenes of hand-to-hand combat where Wilma was slicing people in half. And, it's very bloody, this book. This book is filled with, oceans of blood. And it's uh, Philip Francis Nolan does not shy away from uh, violence and how a war of this type would be, horrific, which is not something I expected going into a book that became a comic strip, But it's but it's but it's there. It's a pretty violent book. And it's written as Anthony Rogers' memoirs. It's written when he's an old man. He's writing his memoirs of this time, of this war, after the war is over. And there's a weakness in this book, and that is that the characters, most of them are paper thin. This is all about the war itself and the technology that's used and how the war is fought. It's all about the war. It's really not about the characters. And so you really never get to know too much about Anthony Rogers or any of the other characters. The only character that really stands out as a character really is Wilma. She's the most interesting character. And that's kind of realistic. If you were a soldier and you're writing a memoir of a war, you might not want to give a whole lot of personal details, You might be pretty sketchy when it comes to your personal life, but you tell all about the war that you fought in. And so in that way, it's realistic. But as a novel, it kind of fails in that way. Like Wilma and Anthony Rogers fall in love and they get married fairly early in the book. Now, if this had been written by Edgar Rice Burroughs, for example, he would have written all about their relationship and how they fell in love, and all of that stuff would be in here. Here, it's barely mentioned. It's very sketchy. And there's a lot of that in this book. Like when Anthony Rogers, goes into suspended animation and wakes up. I mean, none of that is really fleshed out. It's just that, I was in a cave and I went to suspended animation and now here I am. It's very thin as far as that goes. But it's so interesting in the war aspects of it and Philip Francis Nolan's vision of the future that it almost doesn't matter. And he envisions a lot of things he envisioned when he describes the Hans and how lazy they are, a lot of the things he's describing seem pretty familiar in our modern world. He basically envisioned internet shopping for one thing. One of the reasons people are so lazy is that they can just go up to a screen and buy things without having to go to a store, and then they just show up, So he foresaw Amazon, and drones, killer flying drones that are controlled by remote control, are a big part of this war. And of course, that's a big part of the wars that are actually happening in the real world. So there's a lot of stuff like that in this book. It's really interesting. And this is a book that was made up of 2 stories that were published in Amazing Stories, I believe, and put together as one novel in this book. At the end of this book, I don't know if anything was changed or altered when it was published in book form. But at the very last section of this book, at the very end, after the Hans have been defeated, there's this bit about how all the people of the earth are coming together, and all the different races of human beings and cultures of human beings, no matter where they are all working together at the end, and everybody gets along, and it's all wonderful. And there's an interesting little sentence where it's mentioned that the Black Africans are a huge and important part of, the world culture. Whereas in the 20th century, they were we regarded them, this is Tony speaking, in the 20th century, we regarded them as inferior. We being white people, which tells you a couple things. It tells you that everybody in America at this point are all white. And it tells you that Philip Francis Nolan was writing this and only thinking, like many writers of the time, he only seems to think that white people are reading his story and nobody else, which of course is untrue. And it tells you that racism was just so common at this time in the 1920s that he could say, we, white people, we thought they were inferior, as if everybody does in the 1920s, which wasn't true, but that racist attitude was so common that he could just say that. You know, we, all of us, we all thought they were inferior. And look, they're not. Which is interesting in all kinds of ways. But I think that, I don't know if that part of the story was tacked on because a lot of this book, when it talks about the Hans and the Mongolians, sounds really racist. And it must have, even at the time when this was written. And so there's a little bit at the end where it's like, yeah, everybody's great except the Hans. They were the worst. And there's a little bit at the end where there's a theory that an asteroid hit the Earth in Mongolia. This comes at the very end. It's not a part of any other part of the story. An asteroid hit the Earth in Mongolia, and it might have had alien life in it. And it might have infected the Mongolians and made them part alien. And that's why they were so terrible. So, you know, yeah, we've been talking about how terrible they are all this time, but they're aliens. Maybe. And so that feels very tacked on to the end. But I don't know. I don't know the history of this story, and I don't know whether that was added for the book or that was part of the original story. It just seems very weird that it's just there at the very end. Anyway, that was Armageddon, 2419 AD. Interesting story. I'll shut up about that now. And that was book number 301. 302 was The Spider. It's The Spider, Master of Men, number 5. So I've been reading a lot of Doc Savage this year. I've got another one that I have to read before the month is up. And Doc Savage, a very well-behaved and well-respected pulp hero, is awesome. But I decided, you know what? I kind of miss the Spider, a very badly behaved pulp hero who is considered a criminal by pretty much everybody because he's a murdering maniac, the Spider. But he's tremendously fun. So I read the 5th Spider novel, Empire of Doom, where we have an evil mastermind who's come up with a terrible gas, the worst kind of killer gas ever invented, that can just spread over vast territory and peel the flesh off your bones and kill you in a horrific, painful way. And of course, he's threatening to spread this gas all over different cities. And he's trying to prop up this guy to become dictator of America. So he could use this dictator to make himself rich. It's an interesting pulpy plot. Again, very much of its time. This was published in 1934. And Wilmarth, our hero Wilmarth, the Spider has to battle this guy. So Richard Wilmarth is the Spider, and he's insane. And he loves to kill bad guys and take out his cigarette lighter, which has a spider on the top of it, and he presses it against people's foreheads and brands them with the spider. Wilmarth does, because he's insane, and he has his girlfriend Nita Van Sloan, who is constantly being kidnapped pretty much in every story. And it's a ton of fun. And in this story, he battles this evil group and the guy who's being propped up as dictator. And it's fun. The Spider is very, very different from, say, the Shadow, who he's most closely... He started off kind of as a Shadow clone, but didn't stay that way very long at all. This says it's written by Grant Stockbridge, but it's really written by Norville Page. And he wrote these feverish, outrageously exciting novels that are unlike any other pulp novel, really. And they're just levels of extreme craziness. So Wilmarth, the rich young man who has taken the identity of the Spider to fight crime and kill people, he's kind of like the anti-Shadow in a way. He does the same kind of thing, but the Shadow is very mysterious, very in control. You never know what he's thinking. Whereas Wilmarth, you know everything that's going on with him. And he's not distant or cold like the Shadow. He's a very emotional character. In fact, he's kind of an emotional mess. And unlike Doc Savage or the Shadow, he screws up about every way a pulp hero could screw up. Basically, in all of his adventures, everything that can go wrong seems to go wrong. And he barely escapes with his life. Frequently injured. Like I said, his girlfriend Nita is constantly being captured and tortured. And more of that happens in this. As capable and tough as the Spider is in a fight, he does barely get through all of these adventures. And so one of the things about reading the Spider is you're always wondering, okay, how is he going to stop the villain? The villain always seems to have it over the Spider. Like the Spider's barely making it against whatever villain. How is he going to conquer this villain? And how is he even going to survive? Because things are always looking bad. You know, when he tries to sneak into a room, someone's there, or he gets caught. You know, it's things like that always happen. His plans always seem to go astray for a lot of the stories. But finally, somehow, he overcomes all obstacles and wins out in the end. And it's always a thrill ride of fun to see how that works out. And like I said, he's a maniac. He's always on the run from the police because he's a serial killer, you know. I mean, he has no qualms about killing bad guys or people who even seem to be like they might be bad guys, or maybe they're just in the same room with the bad guys. He'll just kill them all because, you know, he's the Spider. And he has a secret identity. I mean, he has as a Spider, but it's the worst kept secret. I mean, how you can get to the end of this book how does he get to the end of this book without everybody knowing he's a Spider? That's the biggest mystery, because he's clearly the Spider. His best friend in good pulp tradition is the police commissioner. And the police commissioner always suspects that Wilmarth is really the Spider. And he suspects this because Wilmarth is clearly the Spider. But he's always on the point of arresting him and things, but he doesn't. But he's clearly the Spider. I mean, how has he not been arrested by now? I don't know, but they're a ton of fun. And this one, Empire of Doom, was great. Loved it. So that was book 202. So now we're moving on to book... That was 302. Now we're moving on to 303. I haven't had my coffee yet, Roger. The Angry Dead. This is by Rosemary Pardo. And this is a book I read for Occult Detective October. It's actually a publication from Occult Detective magazine. This is a collection of short stories, very short, actually, which was published originally in the year 2000. And these stories were originally published in different magazines. And they were all collected. And these are the only stories apparently that Rosemary Purdue ever wrote. These are the only fiction stories. Otherwise, she was an editor of different magazines and she wrote nonfiction. She writes nonfiction. She is probably still around. I don't know. But this is an excellent little collection of ghost stories. It doesn't feature your traditional occult detective, but that's frequently the case in occult detective stories. For example, the character we're talking about is Jane Bradshaw, and she's an art restorer, and she works in old churches. She will go to old churches and restore the paintings and whatever else needs restoration in these old churches. And since she's going to old churches, of course they're full of ghosts. You know, everywhere she goes, she runs into ghosts. And so she's not really investigating, or she doesn't go into these churches to investigate supernatural phenomena. She's just trying to do her job. And she just runs into ghosts. And of course she becomes curious and has to find out about them. I've never really understood the term cozy horror. It just seems like a contradiction in terms. But now I know what it is. It's this, I think. Purdue, I think, was an M.R. James scholar. And the work here is influenced by M.R. James. It has a lot of that feel. And you have some pretty interesting ghosts that show up in here. And some of them are pretty creepy. But unlike in an M.R. James story, most of the time, you never get a sense that the ghosts in here are any danger at all. Jane Bradshaw never seems to be in any real danger. Whereas M.R. James ghosts aren't just creepy and awful. They actually can be very dangerous. But in here, not so much. They're excellent stories, actually. Very entertaining stories. But yeah, Jane Bradshaw never really seems to be like she's in danger of these ghosts. These ghosts are just kind of interesting. And, you know, ghosts just seem to be kind of a thing that happen. Nobody ever seems to be really surprised that there are ghosts around. It's like, oh, this is clearly a ghost. Yes, it's a ghost. There's just a thing in the stories. And Bradshaw just keeps running into ghosts wherever she goes. And they're fun little stories. I mean, this is a series that could have just gone on, but I guess Rosemary Purdue just decides, you know what, I'm done. I wrote a few stories, and that's all I need to write for my entire life. I guess that's what happened. But this could have been a series that just went on and on. It's an entertaining little book, and they're entertaining little stories. And they're fun, and I did enjoy it very much. The Angry Dead. It'd be nice if she had written more, but they're actually, they're good they're kind of classic ghost stories in here. But like I said, the ghosts are not very dangerous at all. Even when they're really creepy looking, even if it's just like a head or a headless ghost or whatever, you never really feel like there's any real danger here, at least not often. There's a story at the end where there's something that seems kind of dangerous, but that actually is the one story in here that isn't a Jane Bradshaw story. So there you go. It's fun. It's The Angry Dead, and it's got a really cool cover too, which is available now you can get it on Amazon, publication from Occult Detective magazine, excellent magazine. So it was a lot of fun. I read that. That was book 303. And so I have to decide what I'm reading next. And it's probably going to be this. I'm probably going to start this either later today or tomorrow. And this is Legion of the Shadows. And this is a book not by Robert E. Howard, as you would think that it would be. As Robert E. Howard and his character Bran McMorn. And of course, Conan is up there for whatever reason. It says, never before published in the tradition of Conan, based on the character created by Robert E. Howard. Bran McMorn, Legion of the Shadows, but it's actually written by the great Carl Edward Wagner. So this is a Bran McMorn pastiche. Bran McMorn, King of the Picts. This is a pastiche story based on that character who was not in a lot of stories. He was in the great story Worms of the Earth. He was in Kings in the Night. There are enough Bran McMorn stories to make up one book. This is published by Zebra, and there is a book called Worms of the Earth that they published before this one. And I guess it was successful enough that they thought, we need more Bran McMorn stories, so they hired Carl Edward Wagner to write one. And I've never read it. I don't know why I've never read it, but I've never read it. So I'm going to read this. It has a really cool Jeff Jones cover, wraparound Jeff Jones cover. So we'll see how it is. It's Carl Edward Wagner, so it's probably pretty darn good. So I'm going to read that next. I have been reading the Fantastic Four, but I kind of lagged on that this week because I've just been reading other things. And when I haven't been reading other things, I've been really busy. So I'm going to spend some time today and read the rest of this epic collection. This is Fantastic Four, Volume 22. I did get a couple things in the mail. I have exceptions to the 500 book challenge, which are epic collections, and DC Finest, which are basically DC's epic collections. And I collect those, and I got a couple good ones. I got this one. This is X-Men Wounded Wolf. And this is from, the great days of the X-Men in the mid-1980s. This has stories from 1985 to 1986. So Chris Claremont X-Men, but it has art by John Romita Jr., Barry Windsor Smith has some artwork in this. It's fantastic. And it's got some great stuff in here. And I haven't read these stories probably since the 1980s. So that's cool that they finally published this. They don't publish these volumes in order, the Epic Collection volumes. So there are some weird gaps in the X-Men, and this plugs in one of those gaps. Volume 13, 1985 to 1986, X-Men. So that's going to be cool. And for DC Finest, I got Supergirl. This is Supergirl, Body and Soul. These are the stories that were written by the late Peter David, who just passed away fairly recently. Peter David, great comic book writer, and he wrote this series of Supergirl stories. This is a different Supergirl from the Supergirl we are more familiar with, and I'm not sure DC's continuity is so inexplicably screwed up that it's hard to know whether these stories are still canon at all. I don't think that they exist in canon anymore. But they were really good stories from what I remember. I read these as they were coming out, and they came out in 1996 through 1998. And so it's cool that these stories are finally being published once again. There might have been an omnibus of this, I'm not sure, but it's cool to have these in DC Finest. Peter David was an excellent writer, and we lost him when he was too young. And that's sad. But we got this great collection, Supergirl, Body and Soul. So that should be interesting to read when I finally get to it. And I guess that's all I have to say. I've been droning on for long enough, Roger. Hopefully this week will give me time to actually make videos and read more. So I will talk to you. I'm really tired. I'm like, I really need coffee. Okay, I'm going to go do that. I will catch you next time.